This one I think we'll use a little bit more often. This is an English question for Sam. What is the difference between a dependent clause and an independent clause?
Yeah, okay, I'm trying to type some stuff up here. I don't know if we will use this one more than...
I use it all the time. So.
Oh, okay, good. Well, that makes me feel good. Yeah, so when we talk about a clause, in a way what we're doing is we're trying to think of sort of a part of a sentence. I think often one of the things that maybe is tricky when we learn about the difference between independent and dependent clauses is that this word clause is kind of just thrown in there when we start to learn about it. It's maybe never really addressed. If we could jump to my screen really quick, I was in a phonetics class, a linguistics class eons ago when a teacher used this system, and it was something that was helpful to me. So the idea goes like this. So sentences, the definition of a sentence is a set of words that are composed of one or more clauses. So what's a clause? A clause consists of one or more phrases. A phrase consists of one or more words. And then a word consists of one or more morphemes. A morpheme being the smallest unit of sound that has distinct meaning in a word like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like ma, it means mother, right? It's a very small unit of sound, but it has meaning. So it's a morpheme. And then morphemes are made up of phonemes. And phonemes is just a word really for the sounds produced by different letters. So this is considered like the hierarchy of linguistic or grammatical units, going from sentences down to morphemes. And usually we just think about it in terms of sentences, clauses, phrases, and words. Typically in an English class, we're not going to get into morphemes or phonemes. Again, a clause can be a sentence, but also you can have multiple clauses in a sentence. So the words dependent and independent and independent clause give us a pretty clear hint as to how dependent and independent clauses function. So an independent clause is a sentence, a complete sentence, a single piece of a sentence that can function on its own. It can stand on its own as a sentence. Whereas a dependent clause is something, is a part of a sentence that cannot stand on its own. That even though, so to be a clause, it must contain a subject and a verb. So in that sense, it would appear like a complete sentence, but something in the meaning of the phrase, because of some word put in there, there's not a complete idea given. There's not a complete semantic idea. So let's think about some independent and dependent clauses. Let's say I'm gonna do an independent clause. So I'm gonna come up with a simple sentence that can stand on its own, and then we'll try to come up with a dependent clause that can't stand on its own, but that could be joined up to the independent clause that I'm gonna give. So I'm gonna go with, this is gonna sound weird probably to start with, but I'm gonna go with we all stood up and clapped. Okay? We all stood up and clapped is a complete idea. It's a complete sentence. So therefore it's an independent clause. We've got our subject, which is we. That's the people or the actors of whatever the verb is. The verb in this case, the action, is standing up. Standing up and clapping, I guess, if we want to extend that. And there's no words that hint at meaning. Like we're not left with anything that isn't told to us, right? We all stood up and clapped. Okay, so that's a complete sentence. So let me give you an example of a dependent clause. Unlike an independent clause, we might say something like, when the president arrived. And I'll put a period on that, even though it's not proper to do so, because this is not a complete sentence. Even though we have, technically, we have a subject and a verb, and so we could, using these words, we could come up with a complete sentence. But because of the word when there's this implied idea that when this happened, something else happened. And because when the president arrived is just by itself here, this would be considered a dependent clause and not a complete sentence. But we can put our dependent and our independent clause together, right? So we can create a complete sentence by combining these together. We can say, when the president arrived, comma, we all stood up and clapped. Dependent and independent clauses can be joined like this using a comma. Oftentimes we also have to use a conjunction to join them together, such as and or but. But this is the main idea with dependent and independent clauses, is that we've got complete sentences in both cases, right? Because in the dependent clause, we've got the president, who's a subject, and arrived, which is a verb. So we've got the makings of a complete sentence, but because of this word when, there's the implication that we need more information. And therefore, this is a dependent clause, not an independent clause. So hopefully that's clear. I'm just going to leave it there, I think, because I think that's a pretty simple idea.
Cool.
Yeah.
See, I think that is useful.
Yeah, I guess maybe it is. It's one of those things that it's like, you better know how to construct them to be a functional communicator. On the other hand, do you need to know that they're call dependent? Like when the president
I've
arrived,
been
I could
fine that
just
I haven't known that.
I could just be an intelligent person to know that when the president arrived, period, I've not finished my idea, right? Like that is not a complete thought, and so I could be a very complex communicator. I could have the full command of the English language, and I might not know even the word dependent clause exists.
But if we didn't have that word dependent clause or independent clause, it would be very difficult to talk about like what
Why
they
it
are
should.
and why, yeah.
But this is a good question, right? So why I mean, and I think math, you guys can probably relate perfectly to this in math, right? So what came first, the rules for how you do it or just the way that it's done?
I would guess, and this is total speculation here, that we started speaking a certain way and it sounded the way whatever people started picking up on and continued in that whatever trend.
Right.
And then they said, okay, this is the way we're going to do it. And so
Right. Well, and I think you hit on a good point, and I think that this is probably true in math too. I don't know, you guys tell me, but in linguistics, they'll often talk about this idea that a grammar can be either descriptive or prescriptive, right? So what it should be is descriptive, in my opinion. It should look at how the language
Describe what
functions,
we
and then
do.
just describe it.
Right.
When people say this is what they mean. They use the thing. But then there's things like the Real Academia Española, which is like this, the Royal Academy of Spain, and they dictate this is how the Spanish language should be used. And so in that case, it's a prescriptive idea for, oh no, this is how the language.
Okay.
Even though of course it started with them describing something that existed, today that's considered a very prescriptive institution because they tell you how to speak the language.
Right.
same here, right? In school when you write a paper.
And I think that's right. I think that
Right.
we prescribe the way, and it's got to be a marriage of both, right? You can't
Yeah.
you can't just say to a kid, do it any way you want. And we'll just describe the way you do
Well,
it.
yeah, that's
Right.
how it's developed. Is you're taught the rules in order to break them. So you're taught how to do it the proper way, and then you adjust based on that. So my degree's in English, by the way. So
Oh, there you go.
that's why it's
You're
important.
not
to me.
just some
I'm not just
rebel
some
grammar
regular
guy.
Yeah. I actually did my whole thesis on prescriptive and descriptive
Oh, nice.
functionality of grammar.
That's so interesting. Yeah, that's
Interesting.
fascinating.
So he's like, I got a lot to
Yeah.
learn on this.